Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan, His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 11, Foreign Triumphs and Domestic Tragedies, April 1973 to 1974. Having badgered and cajoled, bullied and begged enough members of the National Assembly to pass his constitution with enthusiastic acclaim, Zulfi Bhutto knew he could rest easy on his democratic laurels for at least a year or two. Earlier opposition demands for fresh election and a caretaker government to run Pakistan as soon as a constitution was enacted died down. Wherever Bhutto went, he was hailed and lauded with patriotic praise for his noble national political initiative. Wali Khan's dark pre-constitution warning that Bhutto and Pakistan cannot coexist was now attributed to sour grapes, as were other negative remarks of former opposition leaders, such as that the almost universally hailed document was neither Islamic nor federal nor democratic. All Pakistanis love a good fighter and doubly appreciate a leader who can beat opponents at their own game by whatever means, fair or foul. Bhutto had again proved his claim to the title Qaid-e-Awam and found his stock rising wherever he went to speak in the aftermath of early April's constitutional euphoria. On 21st April 1973, Iqbal Day, Zulfi spoke of the reawakening of South Asia's Muslims, symbolized by the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. That same day, he told the cadets of Pakistan's military academy at Kakul, "You are not playthings to be used and exploited for selfish ambitions. You are the custodians of our frontiers, the sword arm of our defense. We cannot permit the insult or humiliation of any citizen of Pakistan." Over the New World Service, he inaugurated that day for the Pakistan Broadcasting Corporation. Bhutto proudly announced that we are blessed with a constitution unanimously acclaimed as democratic, federal, and Islamic. He spoke of my government as your government, thus sharing with every Pakistani abroad who heard him the vibrant hope he felt and majestically conveyed. His enthusiasm proved contagious. Few could resist it, other than such spoilsports as Ahmad Raza Kasuri, who spewed angry epithets whenever he heard Bhutto's voice or name. But to Pakistan's silent majority, Bhutto was unrivaled, unmatched, his political bat as powerful as the bat of any cricket star, his tongue as sharp and potent as the rapier of any field marshal. Bhutto was euphoric not only about the constitution but about his upcoming state visit to Washington, scheduled for 16 to 22nd July 1973. It had been 16 months since his last meeting with President Nixon, on the eve of a long flight home via Rome and Tehran, when dark clouds of humiliating defeat in Bangladesh shrouded Pakistan, and only he was deemed fit to take up Yahya Khan's burden. Nixon's superpower support had given him the foreign backing he needed to convince the army and civil service that he could, in fact, lead Pakistan out of the deep depression into which it had fallen by December 1971. Nixon's support was now aimed at lifting the 1971 embargo on arms, and Zulfi knew that his friend would help him in any and every way possible. Despite Congress's opposition, Nixon and Bhutto appreciated each other, each seeing in the other perhaps the almost perfect reflection of his own insatiable political appetite, each hearing from the other his own oratory and slick rhetoric. They were a uniquely compatible pair, despite polar differences in their backgrounds, and shared many instincts, aspirations, passions, and dreams of themselves and their people, each within the limits of his own national environment. A week before he was to leave for Washington, Bhutto addressed the National Assembly on Foreign Affairs, requesting prior authorization to recognize Bangladesh at his own discretion. Zulfi planned to go to New York after meeting with Nixon and hoped to conclude the ongoing negotiations there with Indian as well as Bangladeshi representatives. He promised that repatriation of all Pakistani prisoners of war would remain the prerequisite to the re establishment of normal relations. A year had passed since the much acclaimed Simla Accord, yet nothing had as yet been accomplished towards achieving a more durable peace in South Asia. Zulfi knew that he was blamed by New Delhi as well as Dhaka for the prolonged stalemate and wanted to be sure he could act quickly once he reached the United States. The Vietnam War was over and the United States had recognized China, and Bhutto was sharp enough to understand that this was an age of detente and reconciliation, not of belligerency and strife. It is an age when the new generation all over the world has rejected the philosophies of hate. I say to my people as I would say to the people of India, do not be sworn to eternal hostility against each other. If you do, only your common enemy, which is squalor and poverty, will triumph. Here was Zulfi at his best, but frustrated opposition members of the assembly had staged a walkout before he had even uttered those words of wisdom. Wali Khan and his National Awami Party backers and men like the former Air Marshal Asghar Khan and Ahmad Raza Kasuri would not sit and listen. If I were sitting with them, I could have made speeches, inflammatory, volatile, convincing. Zulfi shouted in reaction to the insult, because there is much to be said on both sides of the issue. This is what democracy means, Mr. Speaker. Sir, politics is a great art, but it involves ethics. What is the ethics in their politics? What is the morality of their thoughts? Zulfi had, of course, argued the opposite side of this issue, as he had of most political positions he took, and as he would continue to do. He was always ready to switch at a moment's notice. It was one of the keys to his singular success, not only in climbing to the top of the slippery pole of Pakistani power, but in clinging to the precarious perch. We are a product of the people, Zulfi cried out to the chamber, most of whose opposition seats were now offensively empty. We have come here to guard the ramparts of Pakistan and not to destroy and decompose what remains of Pakistan. He meant it. He believed every word. To Bhutto, politics and patriotism were inextricably joined, each a bulwark of the other. Even though the hour was late and the seats only half filled, and it was just a week before his long and carefully planned trip, Bhutto did not stop talking but warmed to his theme. They know that each step that we have taken is in the highest interest of the people of Pakistan, and that we will never take any step, never contemplate any measure that will be inimical or detrimental to the greater glory of Pakistan and its ultimate interests. That is why we have bolted out. These are runaway people. These are people who do not want to face the truth. These are people who would like to misguide the youth of this country. They would like to see the blood of the people shed for their own selfish interests. They walked out with a purpose. They want to create bloodshed. They want the warm blood of this warm country to be shed on streets, not for a national purpose, but for their own selfish interests. They want to provoke the people, but Zulfi promised not to be provoked. The resolution on Bangladesh passed shortly after 3 a.m. on 10th July 1973. That same day, Bhutto flew to Karachi, where he spoke the next morning to the press. Heavy rainfall had caused severe flood damage from Dera Ismail Khan to Karachi since 7th July, when more than 4 inches of rain had fallen on Karachi in less than 4 hours. Zulfi was eager to leave before the next monsoon downpour. He had less than a week, after all, before he was due in Washington, and had planned layovers in Rome, Geneva, Paris, and London en route. Begum Nusrat had flown to Cambridge the month before to attend Benazir's graduation from Harvard, and would remain in the United States until she and Zulfi faced the cameras together in the White House and at subsequent state functions. Zulfi's presidential plane carried an entourage of hand-picked companions and the PIA's loveliest hostess. After the past few months of political haggling and infighting, he badly needed a holiday and was looking forward to this chance to unwind and relax. The insurgency in Balochistan kept escalating, though Tikka Khan poured his best regular army troops into that impoverished, underpopulated border province, whose tribal links with Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as in Iran, had long raised the specter of a greater Balochistan separatist movement. Less than a week earlier, Bhutto had decided to appoint a secret committee of his most trusted advisors, Ghulam Mustafa Khar, Ghulam Mustafa Jitoi, and Rafi Raza, to find a satisfactory long-term solution to the problem of Balochistan. Too many ghastly mistakes had been made there. One government after another foiled and fumbled. He charged his trusted Troika to find an honorable and lasting solution without being cornered. We must always keep in mind that the antagonists of today might get together tomorrow to pull the rug under our feet. The Meri and Mengal tribes continued to fight, daily gaining support as well as sympathy for their struggle against imported Punjabi and Pathan troops, viewed by most Balochis as an army of occupation. Former Chief Minister Sardar Mengal reported that the people were being starved by the government's blockade and it was sheer desperation that drove them to guerrilla warfare. Former Governor Bazinjo called Governor Bukti the most hated man in Balochistan. Bhutto had alerted Governor Bukti in February to reports he had received of the National Awami Party sponsored plot to assassinate him. In early May, moreover, Zulfi reported to Bukti that the Pir of Pagaro and other leaders of the United Democratic Front opposition had met in Quetta at the Khan of Kalat's house to discuss my assassination and to draw up tentative plans for creating simultaneous trouble in NWFP, Balochistan and Sindh. Bukti was by then hard-pressed by Sardar Mengal, Nawab Khair Bakhsh Mari and other opposition leaders in his provincial assembly, who had no confidence in Bukti's appointed chief minister, Jam Mir Ghulam Qadir Khan, and demanded that the governor convene a session that June to vote on a motion to that effect. Bukti himself was well aware of the crisis of confidence over the Jam of Lasbela. Zulfi suspected that his powerful governor had chosen this meek chief minister in good measure because of the latter's reputed willingness to take orders. Zulfi never trusted Bukti as he did Khar or Mumtaz, for they were his brothers, after all, and belonged to his own party, which Bukti had never joined. Zulfi used Bukti as his most effective foil in Balochistan against Bazinjo, Mengal and Mari. He hoped Bukti would help him and Tikka stop the Baloch insurgency before it came a full-scale war, but always worried about what might occur if Bukti joined his rebel Baloch brothers or invited external support for their separatist movement from Baghdad, Kabul, New Delhi or Moscow. Perhaps Khair Bakhsh Mari is trying to play a miniature Bangladesh, Zulfi had written to Bukti in early June. Perhaps he wants to get some Maris across the border to internationalize the problem with the help of Kabul radio and Kabul propaganda. We must therefore bottle up the migration even if it is a handful of Maris. You know the situation on the ground better. I therefore want your views. Without admitting they were his personal views, Bukti sent Bhutto several anonymous reports detailing the situation in Balochistan, one of which noted that the central government's counter-insurgency forces are in disarray. Bhutto has not yet realized the situation. He is still dreaming his dreams of one-party government. His love for whole and soul power has blinded him to the danger of not sharing power. Bhutto is convinced that sooner or later, Bukti will turn against him. Bukti knows this, and so a situation of mistrust prevails. The national leadership does not support Bukti. The People's Party press gives him no build up. So Bukti is unable to give the people what they want. If affairs continue to move as they are moving today, Balochistan is lost to Pakistan. Flying above the dark clouds that hovered over Sindh and Balochistan, however, Zulfi Bhutto could relax, sipping cool drinks, tasting a succulent dish or two, lighting up a Havana. He was on the way to meet again with the world's most powerful leader, and thanks to his mastery of the artful dance of politics, he had achieved little less than a political miracle. Pakistan had been brought from the darkest depth of defeats to such peaks as the Simla summit and adoption of a new constitution. Now, he would soon bring home the last prisoners of war and could then cut a deal with Mujib if that self-deluded Bengali knew what was good for him. And he would bring home hard currency finding and arms from Washington. Zulfi knew he was scheduled to meet with Nixon just a few days before the Shah, for he had visited Tehran in May and learned many things there. Nixon would be interested in hearing what he had learned about the Shah. Zulfi hoped that by playing his cards right, he would be able to leap Pakistan over Iran as Washington's favorite and closest allies in the Gulf region. He could hardly believe how many new US jets and tanks had been lined up around airports in Iran. Pakistanis were better soldiers than Iranians, and he was certainly a better bet than the tottering Shah for Washington largesse. He hoped for nothing less from this flight than to turn Pakistan into Washington's premier sword arm of Asia. By the time he reached Rome, Zulfi felt intoxicated by such thoughts and by all he had imbibed. At Rome's airport, however, he was brought down to earth with a disconcerting message from the White House. The state visit would have to be postponed because of Nixon's sudden illness, which required that he be hospitalized. The illness, of course, was Watergate. Nixon and Kissinger decided that the Shah was too important and too sensitive to put off, but that Bhutto could be kept on hold for a few months without jeopardizing global security. The only major damage might be to Zulfi's ego, which White House and State Department pundits knew was strong enough to survive virtually any blow. Zulfi informed his ambassador to Switzerland that he would stay a bit longer in Rome and a few more nights in Geneva when he reached there. He then wired Paris and London the same top priority messages, deciding that his reply to Washington could wait a bit. He recalled how Kissinger had used the same poor health cover to fly directly from Pindi to Beijing several years earlier, and Yahya helped the Secretary of State arrange that first pre-recognition visit with Mao and Chow. Zulfi simmered but remained outwardly cool, too astute to fire off the message that came to mind. Someday, all of them in the White House and Foggy Bottom would wish they had been more considerate of the sensitivities of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Though his Washington appointments were cancelled, it never even occurred to Bhutto to fly directly home to flooded Karachi or drenched Islamabad Pindi. A 2-week holiday in Europe proved indeed much more salubrious than rushing on across the Atlantic might have been. Khar and Mumtaz flew immediately to Geneva to join him, and by the time they reached London's Heathrow on 23rd July, it looked as if half the Pakistanis in the UK were at the airport, waving green and white flags and shouting, "Bhutto Zindabad" and "G.A. Bhutto" as he stepped out of the plane. Zulfi had an opportunity briefly to meet there with the Shah, who was on his way to Washington. Nixon had recovered just in time for that state visit. Prime Minister Edward Heath hosted a formal dinner for Bhutto at the Savoy the evening of 24th July, and Zulfi's spirits were clearly high by the time he rose to respond to the welcoming speech. The Prime Minister has bowled us over with his charm, and I'm speechless. We have settled all the problems between ourselves. We have pledged that in future there would be no underground nuclear tests between Pakistan and Great Britain. We have agreed to retain our forces in Europe and, in passing, we have also discussed the exasperating situation in the subcontinent. Zulfi was rather sobered by the lack of laughter that greeted his tasteless remarks and concluded without further attempts at humor that it had been a rewarding visit and he was most thankful for the opportunity to discuss with your leaders candidly a number of problems that affect us. He raised his glass to toast the Prime Minister and the people of Britain, but ignored the Queen even as she had ignored his visit. On 17th July 1973, while Bhutto was touring Europe, Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan, cousin and brother in law of Zahir Shah, who had also flown to Rome, staged a palace coup in Kabul, proclaiming Afghanistan a republic. President Dawood, as he would be officially called till the bloody attack that killed him and most of his relatives and guards on 27th April 1978, permitted the king's wife and child to fly to peaceful exile with him outside Rome. Dawood, who had warmly supported Pakistan's frontier Pakhtunistan separatist movement more than a decade earlier, during his premiership had long enjoyed cordial relations with Moscow as well as New Delhi, both of whom immediately extended diplomatic recognition to his new republic. Bhutto waited until he reached home before offering Pakistan's recognition, which he did less than a month after Dawood took control, for soon it became clear that the coup was no threat to Pakistan, but had been launched only to prevent a tougher, imminent revolt by the much younger communist Turks within Kabul's assembly, comrades Nur Muhammad Taraki and Babrak Karmal. On 14th August 1973, after completing 20 months as president, Zulfi Bhutto changed his title to Prime Minister and addressed the people on National Day over radio and television under his now formally operative constitution. Today, we bid goodbye, he said with premature optimism, finally and for all time, to the palace revolutions and military coups which plagued Pakistan for nearly 2 decades. He encouraged all voices to be raised in defense of all viewpoints, but warned against pandemonium. Democracy could work only if there was discipline. He cautioned against separatist tendencies and urged the opposition to rest content and wait until future elections. He reminded his listeners that we have pledged to Allah to permit no intrigues subversive of government. He spoke at some length about Pakistan's external relations and sounded very much like Nixon discussing Watergate when he said, "Let me make it clear that when I talk of the opposition, I am mindful of the fact that Pakistan People's Party may itself be in opposition someday. I am no great Khan that I should entertain dreams of ruling Pakistan in perpetuity." He had, as he spoke, already ordered Governor Bugti to arrest former Governor Bazinjo, former Chief Minister Mengal, and Sardar Mari, but made no mention of those insurgents. The heaviest, deadliest rains in more than a decade poured from the skies over Pakistan that night. Floods washed away more than 10,000 villages, ravaged crops, and claimed countless peasant lives as well as precious livestock. Torrents of mud mixed with deadly detritus raced across millions of acres of scarred Punjabi and Sindhi soil. The 21-gun salute to the birth of the new constitution was muffled by the downpour, and the festive outdoor celebration earlier planned to hail the new Prime Minister and President, former Assembly Speaker Fazl Ilahi Chaudhry, was cancelled. Pakistan's economic losses from the unprecedented floods would prove to be greater than the total cost of the 1965 war. In late August, Zulfi sent Minister of State for Defense and Foreign Affairs Aziz Ahmed to Delhi to conclude negotiations of an agreement with Indira Gandhi's special representative P.N. Haksar, signed on 28 August 1973, that started the repatriation of the 93,000 Pakistani prisoners of war. Bengalis still in Pakistan were to be sent home to Bangladesh, and the Prime Ministers of Pakistan and Bangladesh would at some future date meet to decide what additional persons who may wish to migrate to Pakistan may be permitted to do so. More than 50,000 considered themselves Pakistanis. 2 decades later, however, those unfortunates had not yet been accepted by the nation they considered their own. Most Sindhis as well as Punjabis believed that Pakistan had taken in more Muhajirs than either Karachi or Lahore had room or work for. Mujib repeatedly threatened to put 195 Pakistani prisoners of war on trial for war crimes committed in Bangladesh. India offered to take custody of the latter prisoners till final arrangements could be made concerning their treatment after Pakistan recognized Bangladesh, which Bhutto had now the Assembly's permission to do at his own discretion. With this Delhi agreement concluded just 2 weeks before his rescheduled summit with Nixon, Bhutto had fresh reason to feel proud of his diplomatic waltzmanship. Citizens, Premier Bhutto addressed the nation on the eve of his flight west that September. Mindful of what actually happened in 1971, we cannot but have reason to be satisfied that we secured the withdrawal of the invading armies from our territories and have now obtained the assurance of the release of our prisoners of war. In the stately environment of the 19th century Europe, Metternich would have achieved more, but we need not be apologetic about it. Pakistan's modern Metternich was welcomed warmly by Nixon on 18 September 1973. The president called preserving the integrity and independence of Pakistan the cornerstone of US policy, reinforced the reception which was to have been held in the Rose Garden indoors. I am sorry that the ceremonies were somewhat marred by the rains, Bhutto told Nixon, but nothing can mar the eternal friendship and warmth between our two peoples. Vice President Spiro Agnew hosted lunch that afternoon and Zulfi toasted him. Dinner, of course, was hosted by Nixon and Henry Kissinger was present. In response to Nixon's after-dinner remarks, Bhutto commented on their earlier secret discussions in Nixon's office. We discussed 3 matters: economic matters, cultural matters, and military matters. I don't know how, but cultural and military matters got intervened. Perhaps because Dr. Kissinger was there. We were told that since military and cultural matters are interrelated, we must know that Jill St. John is booked for the Soviet Union and Raquel Welch is earmarked for China. As far as our old friend Pakistan is concerned, Talalullah Bankhead is there available for Pakistan. So we told our friends candidly that what we are interested in is not obsolete spare parts, but in red-hot weapons. Zulfi considered Nixon a great and lofty president and a world statesman.